This year, the Sundance Documentary Grand Jury Prize went to Capturing the Friedmans. The film explores how accusations of child molestation tore apart the Friedman family of Great Neck, Long Island. Frank Rich of the New York Times says it's, quote, one of the most compelling American movies I've seen in ages. Here's a look at the film.
What this woman does is hire lawyers. I honestly have to tell you, anything that she decides, I can't trust. Arnie, they don't trust me. Well, we don't trust her. We lived with her for 2 months while you were in jail, and we learned not to trust her.
David had just gotten a video camera when this case broke, and so he just started recording the family falling apart.
I am pleased to welcome the director, Andrew Jarecki, to this table. This, as I said to him, and I say to you, and I said in introducing that clip, is a film that has captured the attention of people who are compelled by story and who love the art of documentary filmmaking. So congratulations.
Thank you.
How did this come to be? I mean, just tell me the story.
Well, you know, as sometimes happens with a documentary film, you start out working on one film and it turns into a completely different film. And that was nowhere more true than with this film, because I started out making a film about professional children's birthday party clowns in New York City.
Yes, I know.
And, you know, as a
this
parent,
is a long way from that.
So, you know, as a parent, you know, you see these people come to your house and they go to all the birthday parties up and down Park Avenue, and they come for 45 minutes and then they leave. And I always thought, you know, I wonder what happens when they go home. I wonder who these people are. So I thought I would start out making a fairly light subject, and then in the middle it just, you know,
when did it
completely
do
changed.
that?
Well, I had been talking to David Friedman, who's the #1 party clown in New York City by a big margin. And I just knew that he was going to be an important part of the film, and I had talked to him for about 4 or 5 months, and it was only then that I discovered that he had a secret story.
Which was?
Well, you know, he didn't tell me at first, and I had to do a lot of work to dig it out. He gave me a few hints. You know, he would say, and you see in the film a moment when he says, well, there's a lot I could, and then he sort of pauses and he says, well, there's some things I don't want to talk about. And that's sort of the launching pad for what I then learned was a story that begins when his family, his mother and his father and the 3 boys, a perfectly normal seeming family, are sitting around their dinner table ready for Thanksgiving dinner sometime in the late 80s. And their front door is shattered by a police battering ram, which blows up the door, and the house fills with police instantly, who go on and begin boxing up the family's possessions and photographing things, and eventually end up leading the father, Arnold, and his youngest son, Jesse, out through the maze of television news cameras that's by then assembled on their front lawn, changing their lives completely, as you could imagine. And that's sort of the beginning of the story of how this family gets brought into the public eye in a way that's sort of unfathomable to most of our normal families.
What do you think of the Friedmans?
You know, in a way, I kind of love this family. I think it's hard to make a film about a family for 3 years and not have a real strong feelings toward them, particularly when you see the media coverage of this case and of this family's story is so incredibly heartless. Whatever you believe about the Friedmans' guilt or innocence, seeing them as human beings, as I did for 3 years, instead of these sort of one-dimensional evil characters, which is how they were portrayed in the media, is something that really stays with you, and it did with me.
What do you believe about their guilt or innocence?
Well, you know, one of the things that disturbed me a lot about the filmmaking process here is how many people were willing to spend a great deal of time giving me detailed renditions of events that took place when they weren't present. And so I sort of decided that with everyone else willing to give you the second-hand and third-hand information, I would not do that in the film. And so instead, what I've tried to do is to give every conceivable piece of evidence that the police would have dug out had there been a real investigation, which there really wasn't here. And so, to some extent, because there was no trial, the film serves as the trial that never was. It presents the evidence that wasn't presented, and the audience becomes the jury. So I try not to impose myself on it. Obviously, I have some feelings about that, but it seems to be one of the things that the audience appreciates about the film is that they are treated as intelligent, functioning, rational people who have their own intuitive and intellectual reactions to it.
The home videos that you have here, what do they add to it?
Well, it's interesting. You know, I didn't know that the home videos existed, and I had tons of film of the family, 8mm films that the father and his father had taken over the years. But it wasn't until I had worked with David for a number of months, and until I came back to him and I said, "Look, I'm telling this other story, and it has to be told, and I think you should want it to be told," that he finally said, "Well, if you're really going to tell this other story, I should tell you that in addition to all that other stuff I gave you, there's another 25 hours of home videos that I started filming after the police showed up." And I knew when I heard that it was going to be material unlike anything I had seen before, and it turned out to be true. When I sat down with David and I looked at this film, I couldn't take my eyes off of it.
Because?
It's maybe the most personal document you've ever seen on film. I mean, there's no family as unvarnished or as vulnerable as they are in this situation. Here you have a family that is in which the father and the son are accused of the most shocking, horrific crimes in the world. In a way, the bookends of the family, the youngest son and the father, are taken away, and the rest of the family falls apart under the pressure. And yet the camera is rolling the whole time while this is happening. The camera is at their dinner table. It literally has a seat at the table. You know, the incredible thing about this document that they've made is how candid it is that it shows them warts and all in the worst conceivable situation. You know, maybe a very tragic version, because, you know, we're so tuned in now to reality television, but, you know, you watch the Friedmans for a minute and you see the incredible power of real reality as opposed to that reality you see on TV where, you know, the people are starving on the island, but you know that if they spin the camera around, there's a catering truck there. Well, the Friedmans are real, and they're a real family, and I think that makes us connect with them in a way that we otherwise wouldn't. I mean, we have to see these people as real people.
I use the Osmonds specifically as you know, as a case where there's a kind of cinema verite, and then whatever performance element there is there.
Right.
There's also, if you stay there long enough, it's been true since American Family was on PBS a long time ago.
Sure.
I mean, there is just this sense of you get this at some point reality.
Yeah.
And you have this deeper, stronger, more powerful.
Yeah.
Than you'll ever see it.
Yeah, it is incredible. I mean, the police would have us believe, I think, in the film and in all their discussions about it, that the Friedmans are just so disconnected from reality that they just didn't know the difference, and so their taping is just another example of their craziness.
They're just totally dysfunctional.
I mean, I think that David Friedman's explanation is more plausible, which is that, you know, he knew that his father was going to jail in 6 weeks. And so, of course, he bought a video camera because he wanted his kids and his grandkids to see what his father was like, and he didn't want them to read about it in ancient newspaper articles.
He wanted them to know his father was that plus more.
Yeah, and was a person, I think, and perhaps a very flawed person. I mean, this is one of the things about the film that was so, particularly this year, when, you know, in America we sort of have this year where we've got lists of, you know, good people and bad people, and we've got lists of good countries and bad countries, and the idea that there is so much gray area, you know, that in reality you can have a good person who does some very bad things is troubling, I think, you know, but fascinating.
The fact that pedophilia was at the center of this, was it harder, you as a young man with children living in...
Well, I mean, it was certainly harder to make the film because as soon as that's the subject matter, nobody gives you anything, right? Everybody says that you know, that it's secret and you can't have documents. For me, as I got further into it, I found that the thing that disturbed me the most as a father with young kids is what happened to Jesse Friedman here. Because, you know, if this had been a shoplifting case, I think the case would have been thrown out because the police work was so bad. But because of the nature of the case, it's sort of hands-off, and everybody says, well, you know, it's going to be whatever it is. We don't want to be I don't want to be the one to sign off on a release order, because what if they did it? Right. And the fear here is that you have an 18-year-old kid who gets in front of a judge who's, you know, in her 50s, and who says in the film, there was never a doubt in my mind as to their guilt, despite the fact that she's never seen a trial. So you have this incredible amount of pressure building up on a very young kid, essentially to plead guilty to crimes which later he says he had nothing to do with. So there is that fear as a father that, you know, bad things happen to your kids, and whatever your perspective on the film is, you know, it certainly shows that.
All right, roll tape. This is a scene in which Elaine and Howard, Arnold's wife and brother, respectively, Arnold, remember, is at the center of this, reflect on the family troubles. Here's that scene. was the hardest thing about making this?
Well, I think the sense that there were so many vested interests and so many people whose careers had been made by this story, or so many people whose lives had been ruined by it, that I knew the stakes were very, very high. And when I first started making the movie, you had this kid who was still in jail, whose life is still very much in jeopardy even today. So there was a huge sense of responsibility, I think, around that.
How did it change your life?
Well, it makes your life about one thing for 3 years. That's one thing. And beyond that, I think it makes you look at everything with a slightly different patina, a slightly different perspective, because you start, every day.
Because you know that things are not as they seem?
I think, yeah. I mean, you read an article in the paper and you say, I don't know, that doesn't sound right. This woman was rescued from the hospital and she was shooting at her captors on the way out. Where did she get the gun? I don't know. I mean, there are just so many question marks that arise when you read the daily news after you've worked on something like this.
Take a look at this. This is where the retired director of the sex crimes unit of Nassau County talks about why many people consider the Friedmans a dysfunctional family.
Struck us as being a very dysfunctional family, obviously. And you would have to wonder, wouldn't you, what kind of a family situation you would have that could produce this kind of crime. And what might it be like to grow up in a household like this? I don't know. I can't even imagine.
Arnold, again, you like him?
I wouldn't say that I like Arnold. Arnold is a very troubled guy.
I'd say.
I think if you're his son, you probably have to have very strong feelings of love toward him. I think that's why David is so defensive about his father. But I think, in a lot of ways people have said to me, what's the point here? Isn't Arnold unredeemable?
Yeah.
We used to joke that when Arnold was, because Arnold admits to certain crimes but not others, we used to say when we were editing the film that Arnold's attitude was to sort of indignantly say, I am being accused of the wrong felonies.
Yes.
And, there is a certain sense that Arnold is splitting hairs over what he did and what he didn't do. But where the difference is, I think, in this situation, is that his 18-year-old son went to jail for almost as many years as he had been alive at that time. And so in that, I think it becomes really a classical tragedy. I mean, this is a story of a father whose actions, combined with a lot of misfortune in terms of who he ran into along the way and how the police approached the case, really destroys his whole family.
Crimes of the father visited on the...
Certainly here, I think. Absolutely.
Tell me what Jesse says now. I mean, Arnold died in 1995, suicide in prison.
Correct.
Jesse says what?
About himself?
Yeah, and his father.
Jesse
Today.
says, I think Jesse says...
Didn't do it.
Well, he says my father was a very complicated and flawed person, and for a long time I think he was not angry at his dad, but partly I think because he was denied a certain level of information. He was in prison, and it was hard for him to do the kind of investigation that we ended up doing in the film. I think nowadays he's quite an optimistic view. He says, look, my father was my father. I can't change him out. I can't get a different one. A lot of the decisions that he made ended up having awful consequences for me. But the question of exactly what happened in these computer classes that happened in my house may seem irrelevant to a lot of people and are probably irrelevant to my dad, who's now deceased. But for me, it matters a lot because if you come to the end of this film, for example, and you don't believe that the police version of these events is exactly correct, maybe you don't believe that Jesse's father was this violent felon who did things in front of groups of people, well, then the whole police case against Jesse sort of falls away, because the whole point is that he was in these classes with his father, and therefore he must have been an accomplice. So for Jesse, I think he wishes that that people heard him again, and he has a lot of time for it and a lot of energy that he'll put behind it.
Some artists will say, I stand by my work and take a look, and whatever it means to you, it means to you, and that's all I have to say.
Sure.
Is that what you say about Jesse in the end? Make up your own mind, or don't you have opinions? Don't you have...
I'll tell you, I certainly have agonized over this because I do come and have opinions periodically, and
periodically you have opinions?
Well, particularly in this film, because every time you think you have the truth in this film, it sort of slithers away down some corridor, and suddenly you're left wondering again. And I felt that that was one of the things that had to come across about the film, is how hard it was to find the truth, how hard it is to find the truth, how our memories change over time to suit our needs. You know, we think we put our memories away in a box and we can go check on them later and they'll be the same. They're never the same. They're just these electrochemical bubbles that continue to bubble over time. With Jesse, I had a bit of a different feeling. I would say, from a sort of metacommunicative level, every experience I had in this film had something to do with someone obfuscating or manipulating me. Every time I met a lawyer or a police officer or somebody who was there or somebody who wasn't there, I found that the agenda was so strong that I couldn't get around it to get to the interview until a long time had gone by. I never felt that way about Jesse. And so what I would say is that I never had any reason to doubt Jesse's claim that he was completely innocent. When he would call me from prison for little 15-minute bites, which is all you get when you're calling from prison, he never said to me anything that gave me the sense that he didn't want me to do a piece of work. He would always call me and say, "What have you done? What are you finding out? Call more people. Have you called all the, alleged victims? Have you gotten in touch with, with everybody you can? Have you done everything you can?"
He acted like he had nothing to hide.
I felt that he had nothing to hide.
Capturing the Friedmans. Nora Ephron. Do you know Nora?
I do.
He sent me this note saying, "You have got to see this film. You have got to talk to Andrew. You have got to," as Nora would do.
Yeah. Well, I met her actually after she had seen the film, or shortly before.
She said it was one of the best films she'd seen in a while.
Yeah, it was very kind of her. I mean, obviously, that's a terrific person to get a compliment
Well,
from.
you've had lots of other awards, and I ticked off a couple of them at Sundance and other places. But congratulations. It's a powerful piece of work.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for joining us. See you next time.